If you have an older copy of the New King James Version, you may see an article in the back that is called The Story of the New King James, which I think is really fascinating, and it's just a nice, simple synopsis of how the New King James came to be, a little bit of the background story on its creation. So I thought it would be really interesting to read this because I know a lot of people in my audience hear me talk about different Bible translations. A lot of you know that one of my favorite translations is the New King James Version. So I'm going to read this article, The Story of the New King James, because I have a feeling a lot of people don't have a copy of the New King James with this article in it. So here it is, The Story of the New King James. For the past several centuries, English-speaking peoples have cherished the King James Version of the Bible. Love for this monumental work does not arise merely from a sentiment for tradition. Rather, the King James Version inevitably has become a tradition because of its acknowledged scholarship, literary excellence, and devotional quality. During its long history, the translation has been revised in accordance with changes in English speech and our growing knowledge of the original text of the Scriptures. Previous major revisions were prepared in 1629, 1638, 1762, and 1769. It is our hope that the present volume, the fifth major revision of the King James Version, will preserve for our own time the most revered Bible of the English-speaking world. The King James Version. In the summer of 1603, when King James was on his way to London to receive the English crown, he was presented with a petition of grievances by clergy holding Puritan convictions, an action that led the king to call a conference for the hearing and for the determining things pretended to be amiss in the church. The conference was convened for 3 days, January 14th through 16th, 1604, and was known as the Hampton Court Conference. During this conference, Dr. John Reynolds, the leader of the Puritan party and the president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, made the motion that a new translation of the Bible be undertaken. Though the majority present were against the motion, it appealed to the king, and he ordered that such a translation be prepared. 54 of the best biblical scholars in Great Britain were brought together for this great task, divided into 6 groups, 3 to work on a translation of the Old Testament and 3 on the New Testament. 2 groups for the Old and New Testaments were to meet at Oxford, 2 at Cambridge, and 2 at Westminster. The result of this activity was an English translation that bore the following title: The Holy Bible, containing the Old Testament and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues, and with the former translations diligently compared and revised, by His Majesty's special commandment, appointed to be read in churches, imprinted at London by Robert Barker, printer to the King's most excellent Majesty, Anno Domini 1611. While this version is called the Authorized Version, no Act of Parliament was ever passed approving it. King James vigorously promoted such an undertaking, but there was no subsequent royal endorsement. Nevertheless, the work soon made its own way to a position of primary acceptance among clergy and laity. It continues to hold that position after more than 3 centuries. A New King James Version. In the latter part of the 19th century, F.H.A. Scrivener observed that the King James Bible, so laborious, so generally accurate, so close, so abhorrent of paraphrase, so grave and weighty in word and rhythm, so intimately bound up with the religious convictions of the English people, will never yield its hard-earned supremacy save to some reverential and well-considered revision of which it has been adapted as the basis, that shall be happy enough to retain its characteristic excellence while amending its venial, trifling errors and supplying its unavoidable defects. In 1975, Thomas Nelson Publishers, successor to the British firm that had first published the English Revised Version, 1885, the American Standard Version, 1901, and the Revised Standard Version, 1952, determined to evaluate interest in a possible new revision of the King James Version. Because any revision of the Scriptures must meet the needs of public worship, Christian education, and personal reading and study, leading clergymen and lay Christians were invited to meetings in Chicago, Illinois, and Nashville, Tennessee in 1975, and in London, England in 1976, to discuss the need for revision. Almost 100 church leaders from a broad spectrum of Christian churches strongly supported commencement of a new revision. Work was begun immediately. Biblical scholars representing a cross-section of evangelical Christendom were selected to work on this major project. They came from England, Scotland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Netherlands, and Taiwan, as well as from the United States, so that the New King James Version would reflect internationally accepted English usage. Each translator worked privately and independently recommended changes in the King James text. Translators of the Old Testament used the Biblia Hebraica Septuaginta, while the Scrivener Greek text was the basis of the New Testament. The 1769 revision of the King James Version, the edition in general use today, was the English language text that guided the new revision process. The translator's work was then submitted to the executive editor for the Old or New Testament. Word studies of the English, Greek, and Hebrew, and an elaborate concordance were prepared especially for this revision by the executive editors and their associates. Using the original text, the King James Bible, and carefully established guidelines, the executive editor for the Old or New Testament reviewed each scholar's work. Where necessary, they made recommendations for further changes, or in some cases, for restoration of the King James reading. Each book was then submitted to the English editor to be checked for grammatical accuracy, literary beauty, and the effective communication of the content. Throughout the entire editorial process, the work was regularly reviewed by the clergy and lay advisors who served on the British and North American overview committees. The final exhaustive review process was carried out by a separate executive review committee for each testament over a period of 4 years. All proposed changes by translators, editors, and reviewers were considered during this time, including final alterations proposed by committee members. The review process was completed in July 1981 at St. Andrews University in northeast Scotland, not far from Stirling Castle, King James' historic residence. During part of this time, the North American Committee was joined in its activity by the distinguished members of the British Overview Committee. The New King James Version was thus prepared with profound reverence for the Word of God and with deep appreciation of the wise traditions established by the translators of 1611. It is the prayer of the current revisers that the work in which they labored may indeed be, as Dr. Scrivener said years before, a reverential and well-considered revision retaining the characteristic excellencies of the King James Bible. So there you have it. I think that's a really interesting tidbit of history and background on the creation, the production of the New King James Version, written around the time that it was first produced. So that is the story of the New King James. I'd love to hear in the comments if you thought that was interesting, if you learned anything from that, or if you already knew that information. Was there anything that stuck out to you in what I read there? I'd love to hear your thoughts, but thank you so much for taking some time to look at this subject with me, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.